It was the kind of night where the streetlights seemed to lean away from the road, their pale orange glow barely touching the wet asphalt. The air was heavy with that metallic scent before a storm, even though the forecast had promised clear skies. Miles Jensen knew better than to trust forecasts. He'd been driving the Route 17 night bus for nearly 12 years, and if there was one thing he'd learned, it was that the city had its own mood swings. He noticed the man at the stop. Before he even pulled over, the figure stood to rigid, as if frozen mid-thought. Most passengers fidgeted, scrolled through their phones, or shifted their weight from one foot to the other. This guy just stared at the approaching bus. UNMOVING. Miles eased the vehicle to a stop, air brakes sighing like some tired beast. The man stepped aboard without a word. He was tall, mid-40s maybe, wearing a charcoal coat that looked expensive but weather-beaten. His face was clean-shaven, features sharp but unreadable, like a sketch where the artist hadn't bothered with the eyes. Miles gave the standard nod. Evening. The man's gaze met his, and something in the depth of his eyes made Miles' throat tighten. It wasn't hostility exactly. More like the way a stranger in a crowd might stare if they thought they knew you but weren't sure from where. The man slid a $5 bill into the fare slot without breaking eye contact. No smile. No thanks. Just that steady look. Then he moved to the very back of the bus. Miles adjusted in his seat, glancing in the rearview mirror. The man sat perfectly still, hands on his knees, staring straight ahead. No phone, no bag. Just there. He pulled the bus back into the street. It wasn't unusual to get quiet types this late. The night route attracted all kinds, nurses coming off double shifts, drunks, loners. Still, Miles found himself checking the mirror more than usual. Something about the guy's stillness set off an itch at the base of his skull. 3 stops later, a young couple boarded, laughing about something on the woman's phone. They didn't even glance toward the back. The man in the charcoal coat didn't move. By the 5th stop, the rest of the passengers had gotten off. It was just Miles and the stranger again. He tapped the dashboard with his fingers, pretending it was nothing, just another fare. Just another night. The bus rattled down an industrial stretch where warehouses loomed like sleeping giants there. Windows dark. Miles was counting down the minutes until the last stop when he saw it out of the corner of his eye. The man had leaned slightly forward, not much, but enough that his reflection in the rearview caught the dim overhead lights. Differently. Everything okay back there? Miles called over his shoulder, his voice light, professional. The man didn't answer. Miles felt a small knot form in his stomach. He told himself he was being ridiculous, probably just tired. People didn't have to answer bus drivers, but then he remembered something odd. He'd pulled up to that first stop on time. He'd opened the door. The man had gotten on. But where had he been before that? Miles had a clear line of sight to the bench from the block before. 1 second it was empty. The next, the man was there. He shook the thought off. People stepped out of alleys, from behind poles. Didn't mean anything. The final stop was at the edge of a quiet residential area. A cul-de-sac. Normally, by now, the last passenger would be moving toward the front, ready to get off. But the man stayed seated. Miles idled at the curb, watching the reflection in the mirror. This is the end of the line, Miles said. The man's eyes met his in the glass. And for the first time that night, he smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was something else entirely, like a private joke he wasn't going to share. Miles waited. The man stood, walked slowly down the aisle, and stopped just short of the fare box. You've been driving this route a long time, the man said. His voice was smooth, measured, with a faint rasp at the edges. Yeah, Miles replied. A while. The man tilted his head, studying him. Do you ever wonder if anyone notices? Notices what? The man's eyes darkened, and his voice dropped just slightly. That you're always the one left at the end. A faint shiver traced Miles' spine. I'm not sure I follow. The man stepped off the bus without another word. Miles sat there for a moment, staring at the empty doorway. Then he shut the door, turned the bus around, and headed back toward the depot. It wasn't until he pulled into the lot, cut the engine, and locked up that he realized something strange. He'd never seen the man walk away from the stop. The memory of that smile followed him home. The next night, Miles told himself it was nothing. People say odd things all the time. He poured his coffee, packed his thermos, and started his shift, but halfway through the route, he felt it again, that itch at the base of his skull. And when he pulled up to the same stop, the man in the charcoal coat was there. This time, he was already looking right at Miles, as if he'd been waiting. Miles hesitated for a fraction of a second before opening the doors. The man climbed aboard, paid his fare without a word, and went straight to the back. Same seat, same posture, same absence of movement. A woman in scrubs boarded 2 stops later, followed by an older man with grocery bags. They all sat near the front, leaving the back half of the bus empty except for him. Miles tried not to keep glancing up at the mirror, but it was impossible. The stranger's eyes weren't on him now. They were fixed on the window, as if watching something outside. But when the bus passed a street lamp, Miles caught the faintest flicker of his reflection in the glass and realized the man wasn't looking out at all. He was looking at the reflection of the driver. When they reached the end of the line, the routine repeated. Everyone else got off. The man stayed seated until Miles announced the stop. Then he approached, pausing at the fare box. You didn't answer my question last night, the man said. Miles kept his voice steady. What question was that? The man's lips curved into that same unreadable smile. Whether you wonder if anyone notices. Before Miles could respond, the man stepped off the bus. Again, Miles didn't see him walk away. That night, Miles barely slept. His mind kept replaying the same 2 words. End of the line. By the 3rd night, Miles' curiosity had shifted into unease. He considered telling his supervisor, but what would he say? That a passenger was creeping him out. They'd tell him to call the police if it got bad, but it wasn't bad. Not yet. Just strange. Still, his gut told him it was more than that. The stop came into view. The bench was empty. Miles exhaled, relief flooding him, but as the bus slowed, there he was, standing, not sitting, right next to the signpost, as if he'd materialized in the blink of an eye. This time, he didn't even pretend to pay. He dropped an old brass token into the slot. Miles hadn't seen one of those in years. Where'd you get that? Miles asked before he could stop himself. The man met his gaze. Some things stay with you, he said. He took his seat at the back. Miles kept his eyes on the road, refusing to check the mirror. But his skin prickled, as if the man's stare was a physical thing pressing against his neck. When they reached the last stop, the man didn't wait for the announcement. He came to the front and stood there, silent. You know, he said finally, there's a reason it's always you. Miles forced a laugh. Always me for what? The man's smile widened just enough to show teeth. You'll see. And then he was gone. That night, Miles double-locked his door. By the 4th night, the fear had set in. Miles considered skipping the route altogether, calling in sick. But he wasn't the kind to let paranoia run his life. Still, as the time approached for that stop, he felt his hands tighten on the wheel. The bench was empty. He pulled up anyway, heart thudding. No one appeared. Relief surged through him as he closed the doors and pulled away. Maybe it was over. 2 blocks later, he checked the rear view and froze. The man in the charcoal coat was sitting at the back, hands on his knees, watching him. Miles' breath caught in his throat. He gripped the wheel harder, his knuckles whitening under the glow of the dashboard lights. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't opened the doors. Yet somehow, the man was there. For a long moment, Miles didn't move. The hum of the engine filled the silence. His pulse thudded in his ears. He forced himself to keep driving. No sudden stops, no hard looks in the mirror, just drive. At the next stop, a teenager in a hoodie climbed aboard, nodding to the driver as he tapped his transit card. He didn't even glance toward the back. Miles risked a quick glance. The man was still there, posture perfect, eyes fixed forward. When the bus neared the end of the route, Miles debated stopping at all. He could keep going, loop around, pretend he'd missed it. But the rules were the rules, and his supervisor was already on his back about schedule adherence. He slowed, pulling into the cul-de-sac. The houses sat dark and silent, curtains drawn like the whole street had gone to bed early. The man stood before Miles could say a word, walking to the front with unhurried steps. "You skipped the stop tonight," he said, voice low but clear. Miles swallowed. "You weren't there." The man tilted his head, the faintest crease appearing between his brows. "I was always there." He stepped off without another word. This time, Miles didn't watch the doorway. He stared straight ahead, counting the seconds until he could shut the doors and get the hell out of there. By the next morning, Miles was exhausted. He kept replaying it all in his mind, the sudden appearances, the strange questions, the brass token. He called his friend Danny, who'd been on the night route years before. "Hey, you ever get a guy in a charcoal coat, tall, kinda intense, always rides to the end of the line?" Danny was quiet for a moment. "Why do you ask? Just wondering." "Yeah," Danny said finally. "A few times, not lately though." "What was he like?" "Quiet, but, Miles, he ever ask you weird questions?" Miles hesitated. "Yeah." "Why?" Danny let out a dry laugh. "He asked me once if I thought anyone would notice if I didn't come back from my shift." A chill ran down Miles' spine. "And what did you say?" "I said I'd notice," Danny replied. He didn't smile, though, just stared at me. Until his stop, Miles told him about the brass token. Danny was silent for a long beat. "You know those haven't been in circulation since the 80s, right?" "I know. Maybe you should talk to someone at HQ." Miles didn't. Not yet. Some part of him wanted to see where this was going, like slowing down to watch a wreck you knew you shouldn't. The fifth night was worse. The bench was empty again. No sign of him. Miles stopped anyway, scanning the shadows. Nothing, but 2 blocks later he was there. This time, he wasn't at the back. He was sitting halfway down the aisle, turned sideways, one arm draped over the seat. Miles' chest tightened. He kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel the man watching him. In the mirror. At the last stop, the man didn't move right away. He just sat there, tapping one finger slowly against the seat back. Miles finally said, "End of the line." The man stood and walked up. "You keep telling yourself that," he said, and stepped off into the dark. 2 days later, Miles broke routine. On his lunch break, he dug through the old driver logs in the depot office. Most of them were digital now, but a few years back they'd kept paper copies. He found Danny's shift records, then older ones, different names, same route, and he saw it. Every few months, entries from different drivers, all with the same note in the margin: tall male, dark coat, last stop, no incident reports, no names. Just that. By the 7th night, the tension had become almost unbearable. Miles pulled up to the stop. The man was already there, standing exactly where the street light cut off into shadow. He boarded without a word. Halfway through the ride, when the bus was empty except for them, the man stood and walked to the front. "You're curious," he sighed, not asking, just stating. Miles didn't answer. "That's good," the man continued. "Curiosity means you'll understand." "Understand what?" The man smiled faintly. "Endings." He returned to his seat. Later, lying in bed, Miles thought about calling in sick, quitting, doing anything to avoid another night, but something in the man's voice, calm, measured, certain, pulled at him. He needed to know what was coming. The next night, it rained. The streets were slick, reflecting the city lights and broken ribbons of color. The man boarded as always, coat damp, droplets clinging to his hair. He sat at the back, silent, but this time, as they neared the last stop, Miles didn't slow. He drove past the cul-de-sac, turning onto a narrow road that wound deeper into the neighborhood. In the mirror, the man leaned forward slightly. "That's not the route." "I know." Miles said. You think changing the road changes the destination. Miles said nothing. After 2 more turns, he pulled over in front of an old playground. The swings swayed in the rain, creaking softly. Why me? Miles asked. The man stood, walking to the front. Because you keep asking. He stepped off into the rain and disappeared between 2 houses. Miles waited 5 minutes, but he didn't come back. When he returned to the depot, his supervisor was waiting. You missed the last stop, she said. Passenger wanted to get off early. She frowned. You didn't have any passengers on your last run. Miles felt his mouth go dry. What? She turned her monitor so he could see the onboard camera feed. The seats were all empty. The whole ride that night. Miles didn't sleep at all. The images from the depot camera wouldn't leave Miles' mind. Empty seats all the way through. He'd been talking to himself, that's what the footage said, but he could still smell the faint dampness of the man's coat, hear the tap of his shoes on the bus floor, see the drops of rain clinging to his hair. Either the cameras were wrong or his mind was. The next day at home, Miles sat in the recliner with the blinds half closed, staring at nothing. He considered calling Danny again, telling him about the video. But what if Danny thought he was losing it? What if he was losing it? When his phone buzzed, he jumped. It was an unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. No message. That night, the rain had stopped, but the streets still shimmered with leftover water. The reflections in the asphalt looked like a second city below the one he was driving through, warped and upside down. Halfway through his shift, Miles reached the stop. Empty bench. He slowed anyway, and there he was already on the bus. No boarding. No sound, just there. This time, the man sat closer to the front, about 5 rows back. His eyes were on Miles immediately, and blinking. I saw the video, Miles said before he could think better of it. The man tilted his head. And what did you see? Nothing. That's right, the man said softly. Nothing. They rode in silence at the end of the line. The man didn't stand right away. When he did, he stepped close, and Miles caught a faint whiff of something metallic in his breath. You think this is about me, the man said. It's not. Then what is it about? The man's lips twitched, not quite a smile. It's about you. And then he stepped off, walking into the night without a backward glance. Miles didn't remember the drive back to the depot. The next morning, he started digging. He went back through years of driver logs, stretching as far as the archives would allow, and there it was, going back decades. Every few months, sometimes years apart, the same description: tall male, dark coat, last stop. Different drivers, different eras, same man. Some entries had tiny side notes: asked odd question, watched me whole ride, smiled. One entry from 1998 chilled him. Didn't see him get off. That night, Miles was hyper-aware of every shadow, every movement in the mirror. The man boarded halfway through the route. No token this time, no cash. He just walked past the fare box without slowing. You can't keep doing this, Miles said, his voice low. The man's eyes glittered in the dim light. I'm not the one doing anything. He sat in the very last seat. Miles thought about calling dispatch, but what would he say? That someone wouldn't pay. The cameras would show nothing again. The ride was quiet except for the low hum of the engine. But when they stopped at a red light, Miles swore he heard whispering from the back. Too faint to make out, like words spoken through a wall. When the light turned green, the whispering stopped. At the final stop, the man didn't move. Miles sat there, the doors open, rain-slick air drifting in. Finally, Miles said, what happens if I don't drive tomorrow? The man looked at him with that same expressionless calm. You'll find out. Then he stood and stepped off. The next day, Miles called in sick. He stayed home, watching the clock, half expecting a knock at the door. None came, but that night, as he stood at the kitchen sink, he glanced out the window and saw him, standing across the street, hands at his sides, watching the house. Miles' breath caught. He flicked the light switch off, plunging the kitchen into darkness. When his eyes adjusted, the street was empty. He showed up for his shift the following night, but something had changed. The man didn't appear at the usual stop. The ride felt almost normal until the final block before the end of the line. When Miles glanced in the mirror, the man was there, sitting directly behind him. Miles' hands tightened on the wheel. He could hear the faint creak of the seat as the man leaned forward. "You ever think about the last thing you'll see?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miles' mouth was dry. "No, you will, at the end of the line." The man didn't wait for the doors to open. He was just gone. 2 days later, Miles found a brass token on his kitchen table. He lived alone. By now, Miles was barely sleeping. His mind played tricks, shadows moving in his peripheral vision. Faint sounds in the walls. He started taking side streets to work, changing his route home. It didn't help. The man still appeared, sometimes at the stop, sometimes already on the bus, sometimes in the mirror when Miles was sure the seats were empty. And always that same calm stare. One night, near the end of his shift, Miles decided to test something. When the man appeared already sitting to rows back, Miles pulled the bus over on an empty street. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The man's eyes didn't waver. "It's not about want. It's about time." "What does that mean?" The man's gaze flicked toward the dark windows. "You'll know when the last passenger gets off." That night, Miles dreamed he was driving the bus through a city with no lights, no people. The streets went on forever, and in the mirror, the man was always there. When Miles woke, the brass token was on his nightstand. Where now close, Miles stared at the grainy black and white still from the bus's onboard camera until his vision blurred. Every frame showed the same thing. Him, alone, hands on the wheel. The back rows, where the man should have been sitting, were nothing but empty fabric seats. He replayed the footage 3 times. Same result. The man wasn't there. Not when he boarded, not when he rode, not when he got off. His supervisor, a short, wiry woman named Rosa, studied his expression. "You all right, Jensen?" "Yeah. Must be a glitch. You ever seen that kind of glitch before?" "No," he admitted. Rosa leaned back in her chair. "Look, you've been on nights too long. I've seen it happen. You start seeing things, hearing things. Bus drivers aren't robots." Miles wanted to tell her this wasn't about exhaustion, but the truth was, he didn't have anything to prove otherwise. No name, no records, no explanation. Just a face he couldn't shake. He told himself he'd imagined it. Stress, too much caffeine, not enough sleep. But the next night, as the clock ticked toward the stop, his palms were sweating. The bench was empty. He almost drove past, almost, then the man was there. Not walking up, not stepping from an alley, just there, under the sodium light, watching him. Miles opened the doors. The man climbed aboard, water dripping from the hem of his coat. He paid in silence another brass token and took his seat at the back. Halfway through the route, the bus was empty except for them. The wipers beat a slow rhythm against the glass. The man spoke without moving his head. "You watched the footage, Miles." Stomach dropped. "What? You looked for me, and I wasn't there." Miles gripped the wheel tighter. "How do you don't have to see someone for them to be real." Miles laughed, short and sharp, more to break his own nerves than anything else. "You sound like a fortune cookie." The man didn't smile. "When the time comes, you'll understand." At the end of the line, Miles didn't bother announcing the stop. The man rose on his own, stepped to the front, and said, "2 more nights." Then he was gone. The word stuck in Miles' head like a splinter. 2 more nights. He tried to go through the motions, brew coffee, drive the route, nod at passengers, but every stop, every turn felt like a countdown. On the second to last night, Miles found himself driving slower, dragging the minutes out. The man boarded as usual, but instead of sitting at the back, he took the seat directly behind the driver. Miles could see his reflection in the corner of the windshield. "Too close to still. You think I'm dangerous," the man said quietly. Miles kept his eyes on the road. "I think you're unsettling." "That's not the same thing." The man leaned slightly forward. "Danger has a point. I don't. Miles didn't answer. At the end of the line, the man stepped off without a word. But as Miles closed the doors, he noticed something on the fare box, a brass token, resting there like an offering. On the final night, the rain had stopped, but the air was heavy and damp. Miles' hands shook as he gripped the wheel. The bench was empty when he approached. Then, in the blink of an eye, the man was there. He boarded silently, took his usual seat, and stared straight ahead. For the entire ride, neither spoke. The city slid past in a blur of lights and shadows. At the last stop, the man didn't wait for Miles to announce it. He walked to the front, stood in the doorway, and looked him directly in the eye. "It's time," he said. "For what?" Miles asked. "To get off." Miles shook his head. "I'm not leaving this bus." The man's gaze didn't waver. "That's what they all said." He stepped down onto the curb, turned, and waited. Miles sat there, engine idling, heart pounding. Then, without fully understanding why, he stood, left the seat, and followed him into the night. They walked in. Silence down the quiet street, past houses with drawn curtains, past the cul-de-sac, into the unlit stretch beyond. The air smelled faintly of wet earth. Finally, the man stopped beside an old chain link fence. Beyond it, the land sloped down into darkness. "This is where it ends," the man said. Miles scanned the shadows. "Where what ends?" The man's expression was unreadable. "The route." He stepped aside, as if offering Miles the space to go first. But Miles didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The man studied him for a moment. Then his mouth curved into that faint, private smile. "Then you'll keep driving." And just like that he was gone. No turn, no footsteps, no shadow melting into the dark. Just gone. When Miles returned to the depot, Rosa was waiting again. "You're late," she said. "Everything okay?" Miles hesitated. "Yeah, just took a detour." She handed him a small envelope. "This came for you. No return address." Inside was a single brass token. Miles sat in his apartment long after sunrise, the brass token turning slowly between his fingers. It was heavier than it looked, the metal warm from his skin. He'd thought about throwing it away, but each time he tried, his hand wouldn't move. When sleep finally came, it was fractured, short bursts of darkness interrupted by the sound of brakes hissing and a faint voice saying, "End of the line." By evening, the exhaustion was deep enough to dull his edges, but he drove the route anyway. The city felt muted. The usual noise of sirens and distant traffic softened under a low, pressing sky. The man in the charcoal coat wasn't at the stop. Miles waited 30 seconds longer than he should have, scanning the shadows, still nothing. He shut the doors and drove on. For the first time in over a week, the ride was uneventful. Passengers came and went, a nurse in scrubs, a delivery driver, a teenager glued to his phone. But as he approached the final stretch toward the last stop, something gnawed at him. The bus felt too light, too quiet. He glanced in the mirror and saw him sitting in the very back, watching. Miles' hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't remember stopping, didn't remember the doors opening. Yet there he was. At the end of the line, Miles stayed in his seat, staring into the mirror. The man didn't move. Finally, Miles spoke. "What do you want from me?" The man's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Do you know why you've seen me, and they haven't?" Miles didn't answer. "Because you notice things. You see the empty corners, you hear what isn't said. That makes you one of us." "One of who?" The man leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on Miles. "The ones who stay when everyone else leaves." He stood and walked to the front. "You can stop now," the man said quietly. "Or you can keep driving until there's no one left but you." The rain began again, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the roof. Miles shook his head. "This is my job." The man studied him for a long moment, then stepped off the bus and into the rain. The next day, Miles didn't show up for his shift. Rosa called twice, no answer. On the third day, the depot got a replacement driver for Route 17. That night, at the second to last stop, a woman in her 30s boarded the bus. She paid her fare and took a seat halfway down the aisle. At the last stop, she realized she was alone. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, frowned, and said, "Ma'am, end of the line." She looked up and, in the very back, a tall man in a charcoal coat was sitting perfectly still, watching her. Miles wasn't seen again. His apartment was empty except for his keys, his wallet, and a brass token resting in the center of his kitchen table. Some passengers say Route 17 feels heavier at night now, like the bus is carrying more than it should, and every once in a while, when the streetlights lean away from the road and the air smells like rain, a tall man in a dark coat will be sitting in the back, hands on his knees, waiting for the next person who notices him. If you ever find yourself alone on the last bus and the driver tells you it's the end of the line, make sure it really is.